Students. My name is Sam Kimsey, and I am an intern for Mrs. Beavers this semester. Some of you may know me from the Academic Center for Excellence, where I've been hosting the test review sessions. As part of my internship responsibilities, I get the opportunity to present today's class lecture for you all on the topic of imperialism in Africa. I was excited about the possibility of getting to present this to you in person originally earlier this semester. However, with the current COVID-19 crisis, most of us are working from home now. We're all studying from home as well. So I'm teaching from home. I assume you're listening from home. And even though I don't get the opportunity to share this with you in person, I hope you'll be able to pay attention and learn from it. This is some important information for the course today as we talk about this topic of imperialism in Africa, because we won't be able to have live interaction in the classroom. If you have any important questions or confusion that you'd like me to clear up, you can email me at the email address listed right here on the first slide, smkimsey@bluefield.edu. Let's get started by looking at the definition of this new imperialism that we're talking about and some of its distinctives before we turn to motivations and then how it played out in Africa. And we'll finally look at some results and conclusions of this imperialism. So the movement that we're talking about today is called the New Imperialism, and it really peaked between 1880 and 1914. So what are we talking about when we're talking about the New Imperialism? It's helpful to first begin by defining our terms. So first, when we're talking about imperialism, a good textbook definition that I have used here reads, the policy of extending a nation's authority by territorial acquisition or by establishing economic and political hegemony, authority, over other nations. In other words, to put that in my own words, imperialism is acquiring territory from other people groups by conquest, treaty, immigration, or other methods, and controlling other nations by economic power or political power. So why is this movement of imperialism called new? In essence, it's called the New Imperialism to distinguish it from the previous eras of imperialism and colonialism. The previous era, the primary era that we're thinking about is between the 1500s and 1700s, this older period of exploration and colonization in which the European powers were colonizing the Americas. It was the era of the conquistadors, of the American colonies, of the Spanish and Portuguese presence in the Central and South America. I believe you just learned about that recently in this course. So that's sort of the older understanding of European colonization and exploration. But now we're talking about a new movement in the end of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th century, characterized in this modern era by modern technology, modern ships, modern armies, modern methods of communication, modern governments, much more international interaction. And so what are some distinctives of this new era of imperialism? Well, it was marked by a growing involvement of European powers and nations in the course of the world's affairs, the world's actions. There was this influence of European power felt internationally through political control around the world. The European powers not only controlled Europe, but they were now exerting a large amount of control over the course of history and the course of different nations around the world in places like Africa and in Asia. One textbook author writes, it was characterized by a frantic rush to plant the flag over as many people and as much territory as possible. There was this sort of scramble for all major European powers to have a stake in this imperialism, hence the name, the Scramble for Africa. It was a sign of national dominance during this period for a nation to have colonies. And the primary area where most of these colonies were claimed was Africa and in Asia. The primary focus of this new imperialism is Africa and Asia, whereas the older era of imperialism and colonization had mainly focused on the Americas because they had just been discovered. During this period, we're not really looking at the Americas because most of the Americas had already been heavily colonized. They had already been pretty modernized. Most of the American nations had already declared their independence from European powers. And in the 19th century with the Monroe Doctrine and in the early 20th century with the Roosevelt Corollary, the United States had basically declared its authority over the sphere of the Americas. That was the sphere of American influence, not European influence. And so the primary theater of this new imperialism is in Africa and in Asia. And for today's lecture, we're going to look at how that played out in Africa. So when we talk about any movement, we usually want to look at the motivations or the incentives. What was driving this new imperialistic movement? First, obviously, there was economic motivation. Economic motivation is one of the key motivators behind any major historical action or event. Colonies promised to be a valuable source of resources and raw materials. Africa, particularly, had much ivory, rubber, minerals, diamonds, gold, and more that were coveted by Europe. In addition, there was a notion of tariff competition that was going on during this time period. Now, just to explain in case you're unfamiliar, a tariff is essentially a tax that a nation levies on imports. It is a way of what's called protecting the home country's industrial and manufacturing sector by allowing them to keep their prices high. It's sort of supporting home business by keeping the prices high by taxing imported goods, which would normally be sold at cheaper prices than the home manufactured goods. In essence, what a tariff does is levy an artificial price raise on imported goods so as to allow the home manufacturers to sell their goods at higher prices because they're not being outbidded by the international competitors who can make it and sell it cheaper. So during this time period, a number of developing industrial nations such as the United States, France, and Germany were really enacting a lot of high tariffs to keep their own industrial prices up within their own countries and to develop their own industries and manufacturing. What this did was sort of create a sense of international competition because now you don't want to export your goods to other countries because they're going to be taxed there. In this kind of international mercantilist competitiveness, motivated nations to try to gain colonies so that they would not be forced to rely on imports. Because if you have colonies, you can import raw goods directly from your own colonies into your nation without having to pay taxes on them, without having to buy them at higher prices. And it was a way of sort of being able to get your own raw materials without having to buy goods from other countries that would be taxed through the tariff. So economic motivations were a key factor in this new imperialism. There was also ideological motivations. There was an important ideology developing towards the end of the 19th century called social Darwinism. Now, Darwinism, if you're familiar, was the theory of macroevolution proposed by Charles Darwin, who lived from 1809 to 1882. And Darwin's theory proposed that all things in nature were the result of natural selection and survival of the fittest, and that given enough time, all life developed from very simple life forms to more complex and superior life forms, from animal to man and so on. Social Darwinism was the transferal of these same attitudes and beliefs towards society as a whole. Society itself was the product of natural evolution. This idea was developed importantly by Herbert Spencer, who is pictured here, as well as Walter Bagehot. These were both English thinkers who argued that society was driven by natural selection and survival of the fittest. And consequently, societal evolution in an upward direction occurred when the less fit and the inferior members of society were weeded out. Consequently, in this philosophy, it is the societal obligation of those who are naturally powerful and naturally dominant to assert their dominance over the weak and the less fit, over the inferior. It's the right of the strong to rule over and crush the weak, in the same way that in the natural world around us, the stronger animals and stronger plants and stronger creatures will survive and those who are less fit will die off. This worldview of social Darwinism became combined with a very unhealthy sense of excessive nationalism or racism, in which one's own nation and ethnicity is racially and culturally superior to all others. And so imperialism and colonialism in places like Africa and Asia was then justified by this philosophy of social Darwinism. It was merely the culturally and racially superior nations exerting their dominance over those who were inherently inferior. It was the right of the European nations to dominate those that were less developed and less civilized. And so we have both economic motivations and ideological motivations. Another key motivation was national prestige and empire building. Colonies became a way for developing world powers to demonstrate their own national prowess. It was a way for them to show off their national power, influence, and authority. It was a sign of national dominance. And so if you wanted to be a a big splash in the international world in Europe, you needed to develop colonies. It became a race of sort of a reputation and esteem thing. Colonies were also deemed important with the growth of navies because colonies could provide naval ports away from the home country. If you're trying to develop a large international navy, you need to be able to resupply your navy and keep them stationed around the oceans of the world without having to have them all come back to the home country for supplies and sustenance. And so developing colonies around the world was a way of keeping many naval bases. This is similar to something like in today's world where the United States keeps military bases in many countries around the world. Again, similar, not identical. The last motivation that I want to talk about is what one textbook author calls aggressive altruism. And this was essentially the notion that if some nations, races, and ethnic groups are culturally and inherently superior to others, then isn't it the duty of the superior to help civilize and teach those who are inferior? Imperialism was seen as an act of civilizing good for those underdeveloped and inferior parts of the world. These European nations could help bring cities and scientific advances and technological advances in infrastructure and roads and industrial economies and democratic government and so on to these undeveloped, under-civilized nations of the world, these primitive civilizations. They could help them evolve upwards. It sort of had this air of, look at us, how nice of us to help those who are less civilized than us. We're so kind, we're so altruistic. This aid and service often took the form of imperialism and colonization. The poem The White Man's Burden by British author Rudyard Kipling emerged from this time period, and it really captures this notion of aggressive altruism, this sense of it was the duty of the white population of Europe to civilize and colonize these lesser nations such as Africa and Asia. Kipling's poem reads, "Take up the white man's burden, send forth the best ye breed. Go, bind your sons to exile, to serve your captives' need, to wait in heavy harness on fluttered folk and wild, your new-caught, sullen peoples, half devil and half child." Kipling's poem sort of expresses this notion that it is the European duty to serve these under-civilized nations of the world by helping develop them, by helping govern them, by helping them when they couldn't help themselves. It was this sort of proud sense of altruism. That's why I'm calling it, or the textbook author is calling it aggressive altruism. There were many Christian missionaries and missions organizations involved in imperialism that wanted more access into these unreached places such as Africa, and they saw imperialism and colonization as ways of taking the gospel and the Christian religion to pagan civilizations. However, their own motivations were often mixed with a sense of cultural superiority, so sometimes it was hard to distinguish between the kingdom of Christ and the kingdom of Britain, or whichever nation the missionaries represented. And this here is a picture of Rudyard Kipling, who wrote the poem The White Man's Burden, as well as a number of other novels and works describing the British Empire around the world in places like India. So having looked at the motivations for imperialism, let's sort of turn to a broad survey of how it took place. There's so much that could be said. I can't go into all the details. They're too complex. So we're just going to sort of take it from 30,000 feet. We're going to look at the broadest picture of the nations that were involved, what it looked like, who took control of what, in generally what time frame. So prior to 1880, really only 10% of Africa had been claimed by European powers. Moving past 1880 into this period of new imperialism, a number of European powers became involved in the colonization of Africa. The nations involved were Britain, France, Germany, Italy, Belgium, Spain, and Portugal. We'll focus on most of these in more or less detail, primarily Britain, France, Germany, Belgium, and Italy. We're not going to look at Spain and Portugal today. And again, we're still hitting the highlights. We're not going to be able to talk about how all these powers took over all of their territories, but mainly just which main areas of Africa they were involved in and how they came to be involved in those areas. Beginning with France. France had acquired Algiers, the colony of Algiers in North Africa, in 1830, prior to this era of new imperialism. But going into this era of new imperialism, France began to expand their control in North Africa, establishing a protectorate over Tunis in 1881 and a protectorate over Morocco in 1911. Now, a protectorate is essentially a system of government in which the local government remains in power to an extent, but is controlled and influenced by the mother country. It's not a complete absorbing of the locals into the mother country, in which they lose all sense of their own distinct government. They sort of keep their own government to an extent, but it's controlled and influenced by the government of the mother country, in this instance, France. So France takes control of Algeria, Tunisia, Morocco, and then expands, as you can see here on the map, into North Africa. This is a map that I'm going to use on most of my slides. It has color-coded different colors so that you can see who controlled what. The French here are this light pink color that you can see in North Africa. North Saharan Africa was the main region of French control in Africa during the scramble for Africa in the new imperialism. Turning our attention to Great Britain, Great Britain occupied the largest portion of Africa and had some of the most important influence on important regions of Africa. First, let's look at Egypt. Prior to this period of new imperialism, Egypt had been nominally ruled, or ruled in name, by the Ottoman Turkish Empire. The Ottoman Turkish Empire, though, was crumbling, losing power, and collapsing, and the Egyptian government became very indebted to the British and French banks. And what ended up happening was Britain and France basically assumed the entire debt of Egypt. Egypt was completely indebted to them. The government was so indebted that it collapsed and was replaced by a military coup. When this happened, Great Britain became very nervous. They thought that Egypt might become unstable, and so they moved in and took control of Egypt in 1882. Again, they allowed the Khedives, or the local Egyptian rulers, to stay in power as puppet rulers under the authority and influence of Britain. As we just described with the French, this is the protectorate system. So Egypt became a protectorate of Great Britain. Egypt was particularly valuable to Great Britain because of the Suez Canal, which connected the Red Sea with the Mediterranean, cutting right through the Sinai Peninsula. It connected the Mediterranean Sea to the larger Indian Ocean, cutting right through the junction of Africa and Asia. This was very important to the British shipping industry, and it was controlled by the British, and they wanted to be able to maintain control of that, which was one of the key motivations for their moving into Egypt and taking control. The Great Britain also took control in Sudan. Sudan had temporarily been independent in 1885, and then there was a key struggle between the British and the French to take control of Sudan, because they were trying to both assert their authority and their influence there during this time in which these European nations are trying to establish what are called spheres of influence. The British and French are competing with one another to influence and control Sudan. The British and Egyptian forces managed to take control of Sudan and defeat the French between 1896 and 1899. The British also had to defeat the local African tribesmen, Muslim tribesmen, who fought against the British rule. At the Battle of Omdurman in 1898, the British under General Horatio Kitchener were vastly superior to their African opponents because of the Gatling gun. It was a proto-machine gun that was basically the earliest machine gun. It definitely was superior to anything the Africans had, and it enabled the British to basically gun down the African tribesmen by the hundreds. And this sort of demonstrated a typical pattern that would emerge during this time period of the vastly superior military power of the European nations crushing any local resistance. This here is a picture of the Gatling gun that was very influential at the Battle of Omdurman, as I mentioned, in which the African tribesmen were gunned down by the hundreds by the superior British military technology. And this here is a picture of the Muslim tribesmen at the Battle of Omdurman charging the British line, where they were mown down by the British Gatling guns, demonstrating the vast military superiority of the British powers and setting a pattern for what would happen during the rest of the era of imperialism as local African forces attempted to resist the European rule. The British also founded important colonies in South Africa. South Africa had originally been colonized by the Dutch, if you remember from the previous material in this course on the first period of exploration and colonization. The Dutch had colonized South Africa. However, the British took control of South Africa from the Dutch in 1795 during the Napoleonic Wars. A major explorer on behalf of the British was Scottish explorer David Livingstone, who lived from 1813 to 1873. Livingstone was very important to the British efforts at exploration during this time period because he made three major expeditions from South Africa into the heart of Africa, of the southern African continent, to map it out and encourage exploration and colonization for the British. He discovered Lake Victoria, named for Queen Victoria, which borders modern-day Tanzania, and he was also a missionary of sorts. But following the British occupation of South Africa, there's a major conflict called the Boer War that occurs. To understand what the Boer War, we have to do a little bit of rewinding and explaining what had come before. The Dutch had already settled South Africa, as we had mentioned. The Dutch settlers were called Boers or Afrikaners, and they had, as we mentioned, already settled South Africa during the period of Dutch colonization and established two states. They had fought against the existing tribes there, like the Zulu, and they had founded their own identity and their own governments. These two Dutch states were called the Transvaal and the Orange Free State. You can see on this close-up of South Africa that I've put here on the map, the Transvaal and the Orange Free State. And the British initially allowed the Dutch to retain some degree of autonomy. They could essentially govern themselves within the larger sphere of British governing. However, this eventually led to tension when gold was discovered in the Transvaal in 1886. Cecil Rhodes, the British Prime Minister of Cape Colony, for whom this northern colony of Rhodesia was eventually named, he really wanted to expand the British Empire and to discover gold and diamonds. And so he motivated and really encouraged a migration of British settlers into the Dutch colony of the Transvaal, where gold was discovered. And there was a large migration of British settlers now into the Dutch colony. The Dutch called them Uitlanders, or essentially outlanders, and this led to tension because now there's a large amount of British people living in the Dutch colony trying to find gold. In 1895, a British doctor named Leander Jameson led a raid on the Transvaal, hoping that the British minority of colonists there would rise up to support him and overthrow the Dutch government and take control of this Transvaal. This raid was unsuccessful, but it created tensions that would lead to war within a few years. The Boer War was fought between 1899 and 1902 between the Dutch settlers, the Boers, who were in the Transvaal and the Orange Free State, trying to preserve their autonomy, in between the growing interests of the British government, who were trying to take greater control of these Dutch colonies. The Boers fought as homegrown fighters, fighting for their homeland. The Boers, most of the Boers had lived and been raised in South Africa. This was their homeland. They were familiar with the country. They used guerrilla tactics. The British had a modern industrialized army with greater strength, but less adaptability and less local roots, no local connection to the land in the same way. Ultimately, the superior British army prevailed, and the Treaty of Vereeniging in 1902 transferred the control of the Transvaal and the Orange Free State to the British government, and the Dutch lost this degree of autonomy that they had had prior to the Boer War. The Boer War also saw the rise of trench warfare and the use of machine guns, all of which would play out in Europe shortly with the World Wars. It was essentially a foretaste of what was to come, a preview. The Boer War also saw the rise of concentration camps that were used by the British for captured prisoners, both civilians and soldiers. The Boer War was influential in the British establishment of their control in South Africa. To back up and look at the map again from the large perspective, you can see the different areas that the British occupied. There's Egypt here in the north of Africa, Sudan, moving down to Kenya and Nigeria, and moving up from South Africa, you have South Africa, Transvaal, and the Orange Free State taken over from the Dutch, and the colony of Rhodesia here named for Cecil Rhodes, the British Prime Minister of South Africa. In this picture, what you can see are some of the Boer fighters. As I mentioned, they were homegrown fighters. They had lived in South Africa for most of their lives. They had formed their own identity, fighting the tribes there. They were, in a sense, really, this is perhaps a strange analogy, but they were Dutch cowboys of South Africa, in a sense. They used similar guerrilla tactics. This is another picture of some of the Boer fighters during the Boer War. Let's shift our attention now to Germany. Germany was, during this period of new imperialism, a relatively recent nation. Germany had been formed from a confederation of German states in 1871, formed into a united political nation, and they were really seeking national prestige during this time, trying to assert their national dominance because they were a recent nation. They wanted to really show people that they were going to be powerful, they were going to take an important role in European leadership. Germany's role in Africa really begins with German merchants who had made individual claims for themselves in Africa. Moving into this period of imperialism, what happens is the German government nationalizes, or essentially takes governmental control over the German merchants' claims, basically takes control of them for the government. So the German government nationalized the merchants' claims to form these German colonies, taking Cameroon in 1884 and German East Africa, what now we know as Tanzania, in 1885. I'll show you those on the map in just one second. An important event that Germany was involved in during this period of new imperialism was the Conference of Berlin between 1884 and 1885. The Conference of Berlin was organized by Otto von Bismarck, the Chancellor of Germany, who had played a very essential role in the unification of Germany. And Bismarck organized this conference because he realized that if the European powers were going to sort of dispute and debate with one another to try to take control of Africa, they needed to sort of settle this peaceably. They needed to have some rules to keep them from ending up in a large, bloody international war. So what Bismarck said was they basically need to set rules for imperialism in Africa, and the rules developed at the Conference of Berlin were essentially that European claims to African colonies needed to be backed up with what they called effective occupation. Effective occupation was essentially that you had to occupy the colonies that you claimed and effectively take control of them, have a large presence of European power there. You needed to be living there, developing the country, controlling it. You couldn't just put your name on it and call it good. In order to be recognized by other European powers, you needed to effectively occupy that territory. And so the Conference of Berlin sort of sets the rules for African imperialism, judging based on the criteria of effective occupation. Here on the map, you can see the German holdings, Cameroon here in the west, in German East Africa, now Tanzania here in the east, as well as German Southwest Africa here in the southern part of Africa, now called Namibia. Let's now turn to Italy. Italy was also a recent nation, having been unified in 1861, and so Italy was also trying to sort of assert their national dominance as they were a latecomer of sorts to the colonial competition. Italy took control of Eritrea and Somaliland, sort of outlying parts of the African coast. I'll show you those on the map in just a minute. In 1890, they attempted to invade Ethiopia in 1896, but the Italian invasion was actually repulsed by the Ethiopian army. Ethiopia, as a result, remained one of the two free nations in Africa during this period of African imperialism. So Italy was sort of a latecomer to the game. They were really repulsed in Ethiopia, so they were trying to maintain, keep up a good reputation, maintain face, and so Italy annexed Tripoli, which is now Libya, from the Turkish Empire in 1911 and 1912. Essentially what they did was take control of it for Italy. Later on in 1935, the Italians once again attempted to invade Ethiopia under the leadership of Benito Mussolini and actually did manage to ruthlessly take control of Ethiopia prior to World War II. Here on the map you can see the Italian holdings in Eritrea, Somaliland, both of those modern-day Eritrea and Somalia, and Libya, what was called Tripoli, in between Egypt and French holdings in North Africa. And Ethiopia here in Eastern Africa repulsed the Italian invasion. Turning our attention now finally to Belgium. Belgium's history of involvement in Africa is pretty unique. Belgium first became involved in the imperialism of Africa through the efforts of British American journalist and explorer Henry Stanley, who lived from 1841 to 1904. Stanley had become involved in exploration in Africa when searching for David Livingstone, the Scottish explorer we already mentioned, after he had gone missing on his third expedition in 1871. Livingstone was missing, Stanley was sent to find him. Upon finding him, he famously, supposedly said, "Dr. Livingstone, I presume." But that was sort of Stanley's beginning of his involvement in Africa. He eventually he moved on to continue to try to seek to open up the Congo, Central Africa, to European influence. And Stanley's endeavors were funded by King Leopold II of Belgium. Leopold reigned from 1865 to 1909. And on behalf of King Leopold, Stanley made essentially treaties with the local tribes and rulers, giving control to King Leopold. However, these treaties were not really fair. Most of them, he sort of tricked or manipulated the local rulers and local tribal kings into ceding their land and their territories to King Leopold. And these treaties weren't really treaties in the modern sense of international law because most of the African rulers who were signing these treaties didn't really know what they were signing. It's essentially, to use a poor analogy, it's in the same way that it's easy to trick or manipulate younger kids because they don't always know what's going on. You can sort of manipulate them or trick them to do what you want them to do because they can't interact or think on the same levels that older kids and adults can. That's essentially what's going on here with Stanley manipulating the local tribes on behalf of King Leopold II of Belgium. And so King Leopold II claimed control of the Congo. And what we have to recognize here is this is an important distinction. This was not just the Belgian government controlling the Congo. This was King Leopold II of Belgium personally ruling and claiming the Congo. It was his private property. It was the private property of the monarch. It wasn't the control of the Belgian government. It was the private property of King Leopold II of Belgium. And Leopold's claim was actually recognized by other European powers at the Conference of Berlin in 1885. Between 1885 and 1908, King Leopold personally ruled the Congo with cruel exploitative treatment, with violent and harsh slave labor to fund his greedy ivory and rubber industries through which he was trying to make a fortune. The ivory and the rubber coming out of Congo personally enriched Leopold very greatly, but he used torture and mutilation to keep the workers subservient to him, with beating them or cutting their hands off or cutting their feet off if they would not meet the daily quotas that he would give them. This was definitely one of the darkest episodes of African imperialism. Leopold's harsh and brutal rule was eventually exposed by journalists and diplomats who came to Congo and figured out what was going on and really roused international attention to these offenses against human rights. And the control of the Congo was transferred away from Leopold to the Belgian government in 1908. The Belgian government took control from Leopold. And this dark period of Leopold's control of Belgium and his rule of it, with this exploitative slave labor and torture and mutilation, that was really considered by many to be the basis for the 1902 novel by Joseph Conrad, Heart of Darkness, which talks about really sort of the dark excesses and the violent treatment of the Africans during this time period, and sort of the real wickedness of humanity that was showed through this period of some of the seemingly most civilized nations on earth acting most barbarously towards these supposedly primitive peoples in Africa. It's a great novel. I highly recommend it. Just to look at the map again, there you can see in the center the Belgian Congo that was ruled personally by Leopold II until 1908 when it was transferred to the Belgian government. And I want to show you a few of the pictures of that resulted from Leopold's rule. They are a bit graphic, so please bear that in mind. These two, pardon me, are not graphic. This is Henry Stanley there on the left, the explorer who found Livingstone and then who helped claim a lot of the Congo for King Leopold. This is King Leopold there on the right hand. This is a picture of one of the slaves looking at the severed hand and foot, I believe, of his 5-year-old daughter. This is a picture of many of the slaves shackled up together like animals. This is a picture of some of the Congo slaves holding the severed hands of other slaves. And this picture here is a picture of some of the slave children whose hands were cut off. As I said, this was definitely one of the darkest periods of African imperialism. Really showcased the greed and wickedness and cruelty of some of these supposedly most civilized nations on Earth at the time. Finally, let's turn to the results of imperialism. What happened as a result of this entire movement of new imperialism? Well, to begin with, almost all of Africa was colonized by European powers. There were only two nations that remained free from European control by 1914: Liberia on the west coast of Africa and Ethiopia in the east. Liberia was a nation that had been formed by the United States as a place where freed slaves could settle. This was part of the American colonization attempts to deal with the American slavery problem prior to the Civil War in America. And as we've already seen, Ethiopia initially resisted the Italian invasion during the scramble for Africa, preserving their independence at least until 1935, when the Italians again managed to successfully invade Ethiopia under Benito Mussolini. Another result was racial tension and oppression. A very showcased example of this was the apartheid in South Africa. Following the Boer War in South Africa, the British attempted to assimilate the Dutch Boers into the British society. They were trying to reconcile the Dutch who had been conquered by the British. They were trying to reconcile between the Dutch and the British to get the Dutch sort of to be peaceably disposed towards the British rule. And so what they did was they basically assimilated the Dutch and the British into the ruling class on the top, with the black African class beneath them. This resulted in a system of racial segregation that united the Boers and the British by putting them together as the whites up in the ruling class and the African blacks beneath them in the subservient class. The blacks could not own land, vote, or hold political office. This was a way of pacifying the Boers, who had very strong racist ideology, but it resulted in the South African apartheid, which did not dissolve until late in the 20th century. This system of racial oppression was definitely practiced throughout many of the European colonies in Africa during this time period. It also led to African resistance. Many of the Africans obviously resented the European rule. They did not want to be ruled by European powers, and some of them resisted violently. Often, as was the case, this violent resistance was crushed by superior European military power, as we already saw in the Battle of Omdurman. Henry Labouchere was a critic of imperialism, and he wrote a sort of scathing satire of Kipling's poem, The White Man's Burden. Labouchere says, "Pile on the brown man's burden, and if ye rouse his hate, meet his old-fashioned reasons with maxims up to date, with shells and dum-dum bullets 100 times plain. The brown man's loss must never imply the white man's gain." Labouchere is referring to the Maxim guns, the Gatling guns, is what he's talking about. These proto-machine guns that basically were able to gun down the tribesmen who had nothing comparable. And what he's saying is that the dominance of the white man's burden actually was the oppression of what he's calling the brown man. And he's saying that Europe is blindly denying the fact that the brown man's loss is the white man's gain. That for Europe to succeed in Africa, it means oppressing and crushing the local resistance. A key example of this, as we already saw, was the Battle of Omdurman in 1898, when the Sudanese tribesmen were gunned down by the British. You can also see another example of this in 1935, when Ethiopia put up a hopeless fight against Mussolini's Italian invasion, in which that was vastly superior with better technology and better soldiers. Another important result of imperialism was increasing globalization. Walter Moss defines globalization as the process of increasing interconnectedness between the world's peoples and their societies that accelerated rapidly in the final decades of the 20th century. However, this globalization was really in the works in the end of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th century. Up to this point, Africa had largely not been in contact with much of the outside world prior to European imperialism and colonization. But this era of imperialism led to more international contact between nations from very different parts of the world. Africa became involved in the world's economy as a result of European investments in Africa. Africa was really opened up to international influence and international economy because of the efforts of the European powers to colonize and take control of Africa. Another development and result of imperialism was the rise of African nationalism. Nationalism and national identity were not really African concepts. Africa was historically very tribal and divided by tribal identities and local consciousness. They didn't really understand themselves as nations in the way that Europe was understanding themselves as nation states. They thought of themselves as tribes and local people groups. And the European rule gave them a new understanding of what it meant to belong to a national identity. The European rule perhaps forced the African peoples towards a more national identity because eventually that became the only way that they were going to gain independence. As individual tribes and clans, they would never gain independence from the European rule. However, if they joined together as nations, they might be able to do so. Most of the African nations that emerged post 1945 were divided along the lines that had been formed by the European colonization. Essentially, the European colonization drew the lines to form nations for Africa because Africa would not have formed its own nations on its own. This remains controversial today because the national boundaries and the national identities forged by the European powers often had nothing to do with the existing tribes, languages, cultures, religions, people groups, and so on. Essentially, the Europeans drew lines based on their areas of control, and then nations were formed as a result of that. This was positive in the sense that it drew forth a national identity that didn't exist yet, but it was negative in the sense that when the European powers withdrew from Africa, it gave rise to all manner of problems, including divisive and corrupting tribalism, tribal warfare, even genocide, political instability, corruption in government, military takeovers of the government, and lack of national unity. These negative results were because this nationalism that was sort of imposed by the Europeans on Africa to sort of create these spheres of national influence, but then eventually create independent nations, was not really organic to the African people up to this point. Connected with this is the development of infrastructure in Africa. European imperialism brought transportation, roads, technology, modernized weapons and military, modernized forms of government, as we already mentioned, modernized understandings of nationalism and national identity to Africa. They developed an infrastructure to a relatively a part of the world that was relatively uncivilized prior to this point. Uncivilized meaning it was relatively primitive, largely operated tribally, locally, without any kind of connection, or even without things like roads or written language. And this sense of development of infrastructure in Africa is very nuanced. History is rarely as simple as we want to make it, sorting out the good guys or the bad guys. To the European powers in the late 19th and early 20th century, they saw themselves as the good guys, bringing civilization to an uncivilized and prehistoric world. To the postmodern scholars of the present, the oppressed African peoples are the good guys. They're the victims, the oppressed, the exploited, those who are suffering under the hands of Western European imperialism and racism. But the reality is mixed. The fact is that Africa would not have developed an infrastructure, technology, roads, international interaction, modern states, modern cities, etc., the way it did without the influence of European imperialism. It's that simple. However, that European imperialism often came at a high price, the price of oppression, exploitation, cruelty, and subjugation of other people groups deemed not worthy of ruling themselves. Many of the ongoing problems in Africa, tribalism, warfare, political corruption, though, can be traced to the rapid withdrawal of European powers from Africa in the 20th century when imperialism began to end as a movement. When the European powers withdrew, much of this infrastructure that was not necessarily inherent in the African people groups collapsed. Historian Bruce Thornton writes, "Not colonialism then, but decolonization, the swift abandonment of Africa by the Europeans after World War II, lies at the root of most of Africa's misery." What Thornton is essentially saying is that the rapid withdrawal of European powers from Africa following World War II led to much of this chaos and instability because the nation lines were essentially imposed on Africa, but this infrastructure was not really in existence apart from the presence of the European powers. And so the legacy of European imperialism in Africa is a mixed bag. It's not as simple as we want to make it. There were certainly beneficial aspects to it, developing Africa into a modern force in the modern world. And there were certainly negative aspects, such as the exploitation, oppression, and slavery that were involved. Like most things in history, it's rarely one or the other. It's a combination of both, and we have to understand both if we're going to be accurate historians.